Welcome everybody. My name is Denis. I'm a senior lecturer at the Faculty of Law of the University of the West Indies, originally from Brazil, but now almost a Bajan person, a person here in Barbados. We have here a special guest today with us, Professor Hiroshi Fukurai, originally from Japan, but has been in the US, especially at the University of California in Santa Cruz for many years. And he's going to talk to us in this conversation, very informal as much as I can make it, about a lot of different topics of his research that he has been pursuing along many years. And Professor Hiroshi Fukurai is a full professor of legal studies and sociology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He is also a former president of the Asian Law and Society Association. And we have a lot of cooperation in terms of international network of researchers within the framework of the Law and Society Association, which gathers about 2,000 or even more in their annual conference every year. And we are going to talk first, and we also cooperate in a project that we want to implement here also at the UE, that is called the Global Classroom, in which we encourage students from here and students from California to cooperate, to produce articles, to produce papers, to produce interviews, to communicate with each other, and to also attend some joint courses together, joint seminars together. So we want to bring this to here, to the UE as well. But today, this said, I want to welcome Professor Hiroshi Fukurai. Professor Fukurai, thank you for coming here. In your short visit here, you still agreed to come and share your knowledge with us. Thank you for this.
You're welcome.
And one of your main areas of research concerns something that is called ONAIL, or in other words, Original Nation International Approach. Original nation approaches to international law. Forgive me. Yeah, and this is very closely connected to different forms and expressions of political dissent. Yeah, in current days. So first, it would be important for us if you tell us what is ONAIL about, because here some of us have heard about fourth world approaches to international law, but it seems ONAIL is something even more of a dissenting nature, even something more innovative than the FWAIL, the fourth world international approach to international law. So what is ONAIL, and what are the main concepts that we have to, focus on for us to understand your research?
Thank you very much, Professor Denis Halis. First of all, for the invitation. I would like also to thank University of West Indies, Barbados, for creating this wonderful opportunity to talk about various issues, including my research. The ONAIL, Original Nation Approaches to International Law, originates actually the kinds of questions that I had with the students when I was teaching the class called Sociology of Law, which is main sociology course that you take as students, either in undergraduate or graduate level. And when we talk about the legal systems, and all the legal systems are state-based legal jurisdiction. And when I teach at the campus of the University of California, Santa Cruz, and the campus was built legally on the kind of the stolen territory of the indigenous nation called Ohlone Nation. Probably many of you, the readers and Denis also, visited San Francisco. And many people know about the Silicon Valley, Google's, Cisco Systems, Apple's. Those are part of San Jose broader areas designed for the high-tech industries. But those are lands owned and occupied by Ohlone Nation based on archaeological studies for about 12,000 years. And what happened to those people as well as their cultures? In the construction of what we now call the United States of America, and when US and Mexico fought the war from 1846 to 1848, U.S. won that battle and took over the northern half of Mexico, including entirety of California. In the process, Peter Burnett, maybe not many people have heard his name, but he was a prominent first governor of the state of California when it operation in the beginning of 1850s. He ordered the extermination of California Indians in one of the executive orders. And so California spent $1.5 million in exterminating indigenous people. And that's one of the reasons University of California, Santa Cruz was built on, as well as those lands where all those high-tech industries began to establish their research and as well as production of high-tech industries. So by looking at this history and how the U.S. of A. had been constructed, it's not just in the state of California, but if you look at throughout the United States, from the projection of English colonialism, or what we now call the English settler colonialism, from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast, it had been the genocidal violence inflicted against the indigenous populations, then stacking those dispossessed lands by the Africans who are being brought despite their wealth and kicking and screaming. Some my colleagues called how Africans were being brought to not only Caribbean, but also to extend it to North America. So it was quite important to look at the legal systems from the perspective of original owners of the lands. And in the case of my teaching, the sociology of law, it was quite important to understand how the state system had been constructed upon the annihilation and the liquidation of indigenous populations and peoples and their cultures and their traditions. And so how the state system had not only been constructed, also being maintained largely by force, as well as the enculturation using the educational system, or the means of the educating people of the legitimacy of the state system. At the same time, those educational, like sociology of law, which I used to teach, did not teach much about the settler colonial history. So it was important to bring those history to the surface and try to look at the reality of how the situation in which we found ourselves be constructed on the basis of the indigenous genocide, as well as the African slavery. And so those are the basis of how this original nation approaches the international law originated.
Excellent, Professor Hiroshi, Professor Fukurai. But it seems to me that when you use the terms nation, state, because for us in law, a lot of us use nation, for example, or even daily life, we say nation as a synonym of country. Yeah, so our nation, our country. Right. But it seems to me that since you are trying to emphasize, promote a different perspective, the perspective of the original owners of the lands that have been occupied by other settlers, it seems you have promoted a different concept for nations and for state. Is it correct?
That's correct. The state is the, again, international legal communities that created the state jurisdiction, understood the distinction between state and nation. And still, that distinction, believe it or not, still very clear. Like, for example, if you look at the United Nations, and the United Nations do not invite indigenous nations to become part of that membership. But so if you look at the UN Charter, those are the legal script consisted of the participation of member states. It doesn't say member nations. So based on that, again, there had been and there is still clear distinction between state system on one hand and nation on the other. So nation is the collection of people with a commonality in terms of their identity, understanding their own common history, the language and tradition, and common memory. And the state is actually a new geopolitical jurisdiction constructed, theoretically speaking, like a sociology of law, which I teach, was first formed after the 1648 peace treaty of Westphalia, which created about 20 independent state systems with the state sovereignty as one of the key elements that constitute this state legal rights-bearing entity. But again, state is a legally constructed entity, and since it's legal construction, it can be created, it can be dissolved. Like, for example, the Soviet Union, it was created 1917, and it was solidified into a much bigger USSR in 1922. But by December 1991, Soviet Union, which was newly constructed entity at the beginning of the 20th century, had been dissolved into 15 different dissolved, deconstituted geopolitical entity. Same as Yugoslavia. Since the beginning of the conflicts in Yugoslavia as a state, now it's been deconstructed into 6 different jurisdictions, with Kosovo asking for its own jurisdiction of the 7th emerged state entity. So state system can be created based on geopolitical situations. And it's recently constructed geopolitical entity, and it continued to manifest their powers in international politics. But at the same time, the nations, indigenous nations, still continue to exist throughout the globe. They continue to maintain their national sovereignty and try to maintain and keep the culture despite the significant assault by the state systems. Now, there are about 800 indigenous nations that signed treaty with the US government, for example, and close to 500 of those treaties being ratified by the US government. But nonetheless, their legality of existence had been denied as we speak today.
Excellent. So, I mean, among many things that you said, basically the state, it's not some natural phenomenon that really incorporated people with very strong commonalities. It was somehow a legal fiction, a legal construction that in many ways oppressed the existing people who are occupying those lands. And in the case of the US, as you mentioned just now, you had about 800 nations, was this number correct? 800 nations in the territory that we now know as the US. And tell us about a little bit perhaps of these indigenous treaties, if they were fair, if they were unfair, and who had to ratify them, and how about if the indigenous nations, they would not agree, consent to subscribe to those treaties, what alternative do they have? Were they really sitting at a table as equal, peoples, and negotiating the best output for all of them? Or describe, please, if you can, based on your research, how this process took place.
Thank you very much for the great question. And one of the examples of the struggles of indigenous nations, not only in North America, but also throughout the globe, including Caribbeans, especially Afro-indigenous communities in the Caribbean nations or the states. Now, one of the examples can be seen, the nation of Lakota, the Lakota nation, some progressive leaders of that Lakota nation in South Dakota declared independence 2007. And in creating what they called Republic of Lakota. And they did this immediately after the United Nations signed and approved UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And that gave at least legal recognition of the nationhood, which had been the kind of identities that the indigenous people had for centuries. But at the same time, as we know, this very important UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, unfortunately, does not have a teeth into it. It doesn't have the enforcing mechanism. So unfortunately, like a principle of free, prior informed consent, that is, foreign state entities, as well as corporate interests, try to say a mine for uraniums or rare minerals and so on and so forth, or in the United States for the oils and shales and so on. And this declaration requires that the indigenous nations be approached and asked for consent. It's called the FPIC, Free Prior Informed Consent. Unfortunately, this right is, we say, is like the rice cake in the picture. It's a beautiful, but it's not real. Since there's no enforcing mechanism, there's no way to protect the sanctity of the land rights of indigenous people. So this Republic of Lakota submitted the declaration documents to various embassies in Washington. And they also asked for the international community to be recognized as an independent, sovereign nation. But as of 2025, June, no state has recognized this Republic of Lakota. And also, like Hawaii, for instance, had been trying to declare independence. And there are a group of intellectuals, including law professors, as well as indigenous activists in Hawaii, which became part of the United States in 1959. And they were trying to declare independence to secede from the United States. And one of the technicalities they have been using, that Hawaii's annexation, which happened 1898, was done what those activists called illegally, or not through the legal means. It required formal annexation of Hawaii, as a sovereign nation before then, required 2/3 special majority approval. But annexation in 1898 happened through simple majority. So
this is in the U.S. Congress.
It's in the U.S. Congress. So
it required a special majority.
Special
but
majority.
They didn't follow the legal procedure.
No, they didn't.
Okay. So based on this technicality now, they
try to create a legal basis to form the legal rationale for independence. But one morning, which I gave one of the scholars who's at the core of this movement, is Texas was also using the same rationale to become independent. Because the university, I used to teach in Texas, University Texas, so I understand that Texas has very strong the southern identity. Yeah, Texas used to be part of Mexico, and Texas declared independence from Mexico, 1836. And largely because Mexico had abolished slavery, 1829, due largely to the decree issued by the second president, Vicente Guerrero, who was Afro-Mexican president. He was a hero of the war of independence against Spain. He issued the decree to abolish slavery. But Euro-American immigrants into the Estado de Tejas, that's a state of Texas within Mexico, tried to continue the slavery. With African slavery they brought from the Atlantic coast and tried to maintain the slavery So they had the political and military conflicts. And so 1836, Steve F. Austin and Sam Houston, Beta Brothers, and many other so-called heroes of Texas, they declared independence, largely to maintain the slavery. And by 1845, they couldn't withstand the pressures of not only Mexico, but also Haiti, because Texas had the slave trade, very profitable, especially the selling slaves to Cuba and Brazil. They have encountered the Haitian Navy try to block that ships from operating their slave business. And also the Haiti and had the relationship with the abolitionist English the sectors. They also pressured Texas to abolish slavery. So by 1845, Texas were being absorbed into the United States. But again, procedure is done by the majority approval, not the special majority. Yeah. And now Texas, under GOP leadership, using that rationale, that is the technicality, which they believe was done inadequately as a basis to declare independence and secede from the United States. So again, in the case of Texas, there are tens of indigenous people and nations existed, but they've been wiped out, especially during the days of Republic of Texas. You have seen the Comanches, the Lord of Plains, and they are vicious fighters, same as Apaches. And also Kadu, one of the indigenous nations that accepted the Maroon communities as part of their Afro-indigenous communities. And they've been defeated and being wiped out. So again, the state system, Texas was once the independent state, was constructed on the basis of genocidal violence against indigenous populations and stacking those dispossessed lands with African slaves. So to look at the construction of a statehood from the perspective of the original people, as well as the African slave history, is quite important. It really exposes how the state system had been constructed. Not just Texas, not only the United States, but many of those states that we now see as members of the United Nations. So since the United Nations are organization constructed of the membership states, so United Nations should be called United States. But unfortunately, the name had been already taken, so it's still called the United Nations.
And to take, just to follow this last part, in this state-centric system of international cooperation, that is the United Nations, just for us to have an idea, how many countries currently, I mean, if you know the exact number, I know it's almost 200 countries or states in the United Nations as member states, but how many nations would exist today? If we think about the United States, if we think about even Spain, if we think about China, for example, China officially recognized around 56 or 53 or 58, depends on the source that you use, nations there. Even the Constitution of China, for example, talks about we are a multinational state. Right. So, you know, when you take the perspective of the United Nations, how many states are members of the UN? And according to your research there, I know there are maybe hundreds or thousands, but just for us to have an idea, how many nations are there in contrast with the number of state members of the UN?
It's a great question. And currently, I think 193 member states that constitute what we now call the United Nations. And according to the UN, research, and they have estimated, those are all based upon the reports filed and submitted by the state systems. So state systems had the inherent interest not to recognize nations, right? So because of it's how the state system being constructed upon the multiplicity of nationhoods. And so, based on the UN estimate, there are anywhere from 5,000 to 7,000 indigenous nations still exist. And it's a small percentage still, but nonetheless, they also report 80% of the existing ecological diversities still in the hand of existing 5,000 to 7,000 nations. So it's quite important. One, the UN Charter does not recognize nation. It only recognizes member states, rights of state. And second, UN estimates 5 to 7,000 indigenous nations exist today. Those are minimal estimate. As I stated, state has an interest, inherent interest, because of how it's being constructed upon the multiplicity of indigenous nations, not to report existence of even indigenous nations. As you mentioned, in the case of China, has multiple ways of counting indigenous nations, though it recognizes indigenous nations.
As well, yes.
Yeah. And so it's quite important to understand that the rights of nations are not being recognized under international law, except, as I mentioned, Universal Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples that recognize indigenous nations, indigenous peoples, and FPIC, which is quite important, especially for the corporate predation, which are threatening the ecological diversity. And even based on UN estimate, 80% of existing ecological diversities that the future generations of humanity requires for their survival are still in the hands of indigenous nations. So we need to find a way to recognize the rights of indigenous nations, as well as give some teeth to 2007 UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, so that the rights of indigenous nations and the sovereignty being preserved, and their preservation of ecological diversity need to be maintained and preserved for future generation of humanity.
So it seems to me O'Neill is not just an academic perspective to denounce oppression in a history told by victors, but is also a way to emphasize and to promote the rights and freedoms and the recognition of nations that may safeguard, that may hold the solutions for several problems that we are facing today, including climate change, including pandemic issues, and is it so, or is it just a critical perspective, or is it a very propositive perspective? What is really the nature, the essence of O'Neill?
Well, essence of O'Neill is significant dissent of the existing state-based legal order, and provides the alternative to constitute our lives on the basis of nation-based understanding of how the humans and natures can coexist, rather than natures being seen as the property, or under common law it's more private property, and to be exploited, to be basically destroyed, to make a profit on the basis of its predation. And so even state-based courts, like ICC, for instance, ICC stands for International Criminal Court, is now considering, in addition to the 4 so-called indictable offenses, considering ecocide, that means destruction and genocide of ecological system, as a 5th indictable offense. There have been a huge discussions to incorporate ecocide as one of the 4+1 indictable offenses. Now we have genocide, crimes against humanity, crime of aggression, which we finally had the definition, and the war crimes. And those are all crimes and the punishment through these legal processes. But at the same time, since we do not recognize the rights of nations, we do not recognize their natural stewardship they have used to preserve the ecosystems for centuries and so on. And now we see the tremendous change in environment. Sea level rising, for example, is quite important for many island nations, including Japan, from which I was born and raised. And as well as the forest burnings, not only California, but also just remember several years ago, almost 2 billion species, 2 billion animals died in Australia, the bushfires. And the fires even reached across the Pacific to Argentina. And so those are as a result of the state and the state-assisted corporate predation of the destruction of the ecodiversity which indigenous nations had preserved for many centuries. So even a state-based criminal justice system is now looking into the ecocide as very important crimes committed against not only humans, but also non-humans.
But this seems to me to be quite innovative, because also you're not just proposing a change of paradigm, a change of perspective from the state-centric perspective to a nation-based perspective. You're also connecting this with the rights of nature, with the protection of nature, with perhaps new personality or new legal personality given to nature and natural entities. But all of this, Professor Fukurai, we have been seeing in many different countries. Yeah. People are starting to develop these ideas. So, but these are very dissenting. They have a very dissenting nature here. They are not they're not dominant ideas yet. And just now, for example, I have seen some activists, climate change activists, and they have been ridiculed, and they have been demeaned by media, by traditional politicians, and so on. So my question to you is, how is your institution, the University of California, Santa Cruz, receiving the work that you have been promoting there, and how are the students paying attention or caring about these topics? I mean, are they really concerned with this, or they find this as, oh no, this is boring, this is something that is not connected with our reality? Sure. You know, especially in a state like California, which is one of the richest, if not the richest, the wealthiest state in the US, where consumerism is very strong. You know, are they really caring about this? And is the university supporting you? You know, because I also know a little bit of your work, and you also talk about some anarchist forms of education and some social movements that were very important to question old paradigms in the past, hegemonic ideas. So how is the education there? Do you have the space for this? Because here, for example, at UE, a lot of people normally say, we are conservative and so on. And I say, we are not conservative. We are diverse, you know, and we have conservative and different perspectives all living together, all competing in the same environment. But how is there in California, especially under this new U.S. administration that is so controversial in many ways? Yeah?
Yes. One of the ways in which I think California dealt with all those mounting problems of social and political issues, including environmental issues, because the forest burning had been a big issue for the past 4 or 5 years. And in fact, a couple of years ago, there was a warning to those who live close to the University of California, Santa Cruz. I had to evacuate for a week. So I had to evacuate for a week with my wife and so on. So environmental issues are quite important. But at the same time, I think we understand how we got to this point. That's one of the reasons I started our conversation going back to the indigenous nations, and how, in the case of San Jose, Santa Cruz, and San Francisco, the Ohlone Nation had been assaulted, and they've been annihilated and exterminated. Still, the survivors of all nations, they create the collaboration, and it's called Amamutsun Oloni Nation, and organization which try to maintain the indigenous way of life. And we know that the Oloni nations had the so-called control burning for periodically to make sure that the forest fire would not happen for many centuries. But again, when the Spaniards came, and then California became part of the United States, although the indigenous nations which remained and survived had been wiped out largely. And so this control burning, any stewardship that the indigenous nations had practiced had gone. And we can see the result now. I mean, so you have to evacuate. Even the whole city of Paradise had been wiped out. And so I think California had begun to look at the falsity of how this catastrophe began to take place with more frequency. And one of the ways in which you can address that is going back and how the state of California was constructed. As you have mentioned, California is said to be fourth, if not largest economy in the world, perhaps larger than even France. But at the same time, it doesn't have any free healthcare. It doesn't have free education. We used to have free education. University of California was education free when it opened its door in 1868 until 1968. But Ronald Reagan became governor, and he began charging tuitions. Now it's quite expensive to even attend the public university like University of California. So we began to see how this predation of the history caused all those emergencies and all kinds of ills. And one of the ways in which California started looking into is how the state was constructed and how Africans were brought, especially from the mid-1800s, the 19th century. And so Gavin Newsom began to create the committee to look into the history. And one of the ways in which he responded to those demands was to create a task force for reparation for descendants of enslaved Africans. And so it formed of 7 members. And last year they came out with recommendations. And one of them happened to be a member of Japanese American Citizens League. It's called JSCL. And he's the only non-black member. He's a Japanese American. He was the member of reparation team that successfully won reparation case against the U.S. government in 1988. And his name is, I think it's open, so I can say that, Dan Tamaki. And he's a lawyer. And he's, again, a member of JSCL. And along with his friend, Dale Minami, again, name is already open. But again, Dan was part of this the task force, and he made recommendations. One of them is to reparation and directly to the descendants of the Africans. At the same time, create the system to repair the relationship, including it based upon the restorative justice. That's the legal system to restore the relationship, not based on the punitive measures. Like if you do something wrong, then you face incarcerations. In the extreme case, you face the death penalty. But restorative justice for the past wrong conducted by the state system include restorative justice, restoration of relationship, return of the lands, if possible, to the indigenous, as well as the Afro communities, because there had been a very strong movement to look at the descendants of enslaved Africans as the part of or even member of indigenous communities to be included, thereby to be included under the protection of UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. And that movement is very strong. So you have Afro-Indigenous communities united, demanding for reparation. So in the case of California reparation, task force recommendation is restorative justice. One of them is rehabilitation, intergenerational transmissional traumas of being enslaved. And so it creates all kinds of traumas. So it's transmitted from one generation to another. So it calls for the rehabilitation and all kinds of measures to make sure that the people suffering from that trauma need to be dealt with, and also all kinds of support system to those people. So those are part of the task force recommendations. There are many, and it's been published. It's online. So anybody who's interested on California reparation for descendants of enslaved Africans, people should take a look at it. And again, Dan Tamaki is one of the authors. And again, proud member of Japanese American Citizens League, which I'm the trustee board member of its chapter in Watsonville and Santa Cruz.
Okay, and this is a very important topic here in the Caribbean context, the issue of reparation. And as you said, it's not just about money then, because a lot of people, dismiss this saying, they will never pay us money, or there's, we cannot blame the past, and people who lived in the past for, and their descendants for still what we suffer today. But how was this process? If you can give us more details, it's not just about money. So what is the concept, what is a model of reparation that you have studied that we could learn from and that we can, study for us to extract lessons for the discussions that we are having here in the Caribbean?
It's a great question. And I can give you one concrete example, which went through this reparation process, negotiations for many, many years, and came out in the end successful, persuading the state government to respond to the demands of the party which had been injured. And then reparation had been recognized. That's in the case of Japanese and Japanese American reparation case. And as we know, the 1941, Japan, Imperial Japan, attacked Pearl Harbor, as well as other Anglo-American bases in their own colonies, like Hawaii was still a colony of the United States. We talked about the annexation based on some of the activists. Annexation was not performed properly, but nonetheless, Pearl Harbor was one of the key naval stations of the United States. Also, Japan attacked Singapore and also Philippines. And not only naval base, but Mindanao, that's marine airfields, and later Hong Kong, which was the British colony ever since the Britain took through the Opium War. Britain tried to sell opium, and Qing dynasty refused, and they lost the war, and they lost Hong Kong and a few other ports. In Shanghai was forced to open for trade. So Japan tried to attack those places, 1941, especially in the case of Pearl Harbor, 1941, December 7th. And then immediately the President, Roosevelt, issued the Executive Order 9066 to transfer Japanese and Japanese Americans, especially many of those Japanese Americans lived in the West Coast from Seattle to San Diego. So they are moved into relocation camps, which were more of like concentration camp. And so there had been a violation of constitutional protection because a large proportion of those Japanese and Japanese Americans are actually citizens.
US
They're born.
citizens, yeah.
And so from 1941, 42 until 1943, 45, the end of Second World War, they are being interned, and they lost their houses, they lost their properties, they lost their businesses, especially the truck industries. The Japanese began to develop, and large properties being taken. And so they went back in places where they no longer are owners of their properties they once owned. So from many decades of this movement for the reparation, and momentum started from 1960s, the civil rights movement, when the African Americans demanded for their accommodation, not only in the restaurants, but also in the educational settings and the public settings, as well as Chicano Chicanas, especially in California. The movement was very strong because California was once Mexico. And so there are many Mexican descendants, Mexicans living there, and their cousins living in the south of the border. And there are also many indigenous people try to restore their rights under the treaty rights, which U.S. government largely accepted as well as ratified, as well as Japanese and Chinese, Chinese being in California since mid-19th century throughout. And there are some instances of anti-Chinese demonstrations, including lynching, not only in the state of California, but Wyoming and even Colorado and other places. So those marginalized populations began to ask for the rights they believed that they should have. And then this reparation movement also began momentum into 70s and 80s. And 1980s, reparation movement get the momentum with the support of many other organizations, including NAACP, that's African American Black organization that supported, as well as Chicano Chicana, Latino Latina organizations, indigenous organizations supported. So in 1988, finally, with a push by Asian Law Caucus, and as I mentioned, Dan Tamaki, Deo Minami, and other young and Asian lawyers, finally succeeded that reparation bill being passed under Reagan administration. And not only the money they received, but what they asked for, the apology by the U.S. government. And that's what they got. And so each one of those people received the apology letter, letter of apology by the President Reagan. Reagan was very hawkish. As you know, he pushed for neoliberal policies, privatization of many of the state entities and so on. But nonetheless, he agreed the reparations should be recognized. So he signed those letters. And each one of those people who received the letter, I mean, the letter was much more significant than whatever the money they received. So reparation is not just for the monetary compensation, which is a very big part, of course, but also recognition of the past wrong done by the government. And I think that's is very important part of reparation movement. And now here in Barbados, as well as Caribbean nations. And the reparation movement, I think, is quite important. And maybe this Japanese reparation case can be seen as a model, one of the models from which maybe the movement can gain the momentum.
Excellent.
To achieve its goals.
Professor Fukurai, I think this is an excellent way to end our conversation, because unfortunately we don't have that much time. But I would like to thank you again for coming here, for coming to the island, for coming to the University of the West Indies, for coming to our studio here to talk to us. Hopefully your ideas, your work gains also some space here. And I know that I'm telling my students and I'm giving them some of your articles, indicating your books as well, because I think it's very important sometimes not to follow the crowd, but to go against the crowd in a little bit, because it's important. The idea of a university is not just unity, but it's diversity of perspectives.
Right.
And what you brought to us here with the idea of oneo, and the differences between oneo and fueo, which is the fourth world approach to international law, they're very important as well, because I remember when I was at school still in Brazil, I would learn about the first word, the second word, the third word. And somehow Brazil, Latin America, the Caribbean, we would be considered third word. And then I would be not happy with this. I would be very uncomfortable with this hierarchy. Why those who created this classification label themselves as first word? First comes first, at the top, and we emerging economies, we are at the bottom there. It seems that we are not as good as they are. And then once a lot of scholars create this new movement, this new approach of a forced word international approach to international law, I said, you are just using the same system that exists already. So when you come up with the original nation or first nations, actually they are the first word. The original nations, they are the first word. They are not the occupiers, the oppressors. Then this made a lot of sense. And also your ideas concerning the UN, that we think sometimes UN represents the utmost diversity in our planet. It's not. It only congregates about 190 countries or state members, and the data that you gave to us, the information that you gave to us, in terms of nations, we have from 5,000 to 7,000. And this is a data that comes from the United Nations itself. That should be the minimum there. Maybe there are even more. But I thank you again. I hope you have a pleasant stay here in the island, that you come back to visit us, that the cooperation between the University of California, Santa Cruz, and the University of the West Indies can prosper, can be, be further explored. And thank you again. And that's it.
You're welcome. Thank you very much, Professor Denis Halis.